Episode 11: The Burning Monastery. Imagine a library burning. Not a modern library with metal shelves and fire suppression systems, but a medieval monastery library, wooden building, parchment manuscripts, centuries of accumulated knowledge rendered in ink and illumination by the patient hands of scribes who spent lifetimes copying, preserving, creating. The fire starts deliberately. Soldiers torch the building as part of a military campaign. The flames climb wooden walls, reach the roof timbers, find the manuscripts. Parchment, made from animal skin, resists fire better than paper would, but it cannot resist indefinitely. The pages curl, blacken, ignite. The ink, iron gall, painstakingly prepared, oxidizes and vanishes. The illuminations, gold leaf, precious pigments, hours of delicate artistry, melt and char. In minutes, a single manuscript representing months or years of labor is reduced to ash. In an hour, a library representing centuries of accumulated knowledge is gone. Chronicles recording the history of the region, the births and deaths, the wars and harvests, the saints and sinners, all reduced to carbon and smoke. The monks who created and preserved these works may be dead already, killed in the initial assault. Or they may be standing at a distance, forced to watch their life's work burn, knowing that what is being destroyed cannot be replaced, that knowledge is vanishing that will never be recovered. This happened at Orusjärvi in the Salmi region. A monastery or significant church stood there, ancient even by the standards of the 16th or 17th century, 300 years old, people told Theodor Schwint in 1879, suggesting foundation perhaps in the 1200s or 1300s. It possessed chronicles, records stretching back through centuries, documenting the spiritual and temporal life of the Lake Ladoga Karelian communities. And then Swedish forces came, and the monastery burned, and the chronicles turned to ash, and 300 years of recorded history vanished in an afternoon. Stand with me now in the ruins, not the physical ruins, for even those were mostly gone by Schwindt's time, but the ruins of memory, the ash trace of what was lost. Feel the weight of absent knowledge, the books that will never be read again, the voices that recorded themselves in writing and then were silenced forever. This is the story of the burning monastery, of what is lost when centers of learning and faith are destroyed, of the particular catastrophe that is the deliberate annihilation of knowledge, and of the stubborn persistence of what cannot be burned, memory, faith, and the human capacity to begin again from ashes. The monasteries as cultural centers. Before we witness their destruction, we must understand what the Lake Ladoga monasteries were and what they meant to the communities that supported them. Monasteries in the Orthodox Christian tradition were not simply places of worship. They were comprehensive cultural institutions serving multiple interconnected functions. Religious centers, obviously, primarily, monasteries were places of prayer and worship. Monks followed elaborate liturgical schedules, conducting services throughout the day and night, maintaining the perpetual prayer that was understood as protecting the community and pleasing God. They celebrated the sacraments, provided pastoral care, served as spiritual counselors to the surrounding population. Educational institutions, monasteries taught literacy, theology, music, especially liturgical chant, and various practical skills. Boys from the surrounding communities might be sent to monasteries for education. Some became monks, others returned to secular life carrying what they had learned. Economic centers, monasteries were often wealthy institutions, owning land, operating farms and fisheries, engaging in trade. They employed lay workers, provided markets for local goods, and served as sources of credit and economic stability. The destruction of a monastery was not just a spiritual loss but an economic catastrophe for the region. Hospitals and hospices, monasteries cared for the sick, provided shelter for travelers, and offered refuge to the poor and displaced. In regions without secular social services, monasteries filled crucial welfare functions. Libraries and scriptoria, perhaps most importantly for our purposes, monasteries preserved knowledge. They maintained libraries of religious and secular texts. They operated scriptoria where monks copied manuscripts, preserving ancient texts and creating new ones. They kept chronicles recording local history, copying and continuing records that stretched back generations. Cultural repositories. Monasteries preserved icons, liturgical objects, relics, and other items of religious and cultural significance. They were museums before the concept of museums existed, holding treasures that connected present communities to their past. The Lake Ladoga monasteries, Monastery, Orusjärvi, and others whose names have been forgotten, served all these functions. They were not peripheral institutions but central ones, essential to the religious, economic, educational, and cultural life of the region, which made their destruction catastrophic in ways that transcended the immediate violence. The pattern of destruction. The destruction of monasteries around Lake Ladoga followed a pattern that repeated across multiple conflicts, primarily during the Swedish-Russian wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. Swedish forces advancing into the region had multiple motivations for targeting monasteries. Military strategy. Monasteries were often fortified or located in defensible positions. They might serve as rallying points for resistance, as supply depots for enemy forces, or as intelligence-gathering centers. Destroying them eliminated potential military threats. Economic warfare. Monasteries were wealthy. Destroying them impoverished the enemy, eliminating economic resources that might support continued resistance. It also provided opportunities for plunder. Before burning a monastery, soldiers would loot whatever portable wealth it contained. Religious hostility. This was an era of intense religious conflict in Europe. Protestant Sweden viewed Orthodox monasteries as centers of false religion, worthy of destruction on theological grounds. The destruction was not merely military necessity but holy war, the elimination of spiritual error. Terror tactics. Destroying the most sacred, most culturally significant institutions in a region sent a message: submit, or everything you value will be annihilated. The psychological impact of watching your monastery burn, the center of your faith, the repository of your history, could break resistance more effectively than military defeat alone. The pattern, repeated at multiple locations. First, the army approaches. If the monks have warning, they attempt to save what they can, hiding treasures, evacuating precious manuscripts, casting bells into lakes as we discussed in an earlier episode. Then the assault. Monasteries were not military fortifications and could rarely resist professional armies. The defenders, if any, are quickly overwhelmed. Monks are killed, scattered, or taken captive. Then the looting. Soldiers search for valuables, gold and silver liturgical vessels, icon covers studded with gems, anything portable and valuable. Some items are taken as plunder. Some are destroyed in contempt, icons smashed, vessels melted down, sacred objects profaned. Finally, the burning. Buildings are torched. Wooden structures go up quickly. Stone buildings may resist the flames, but their wooden roofs, floors, and contents burn. The libraries burn. The chronicles burn. The accumulated cultural wealth of centuries turns to ash in hours. And then the army moves on, leaving ruins behind. Orusjärvi, the Lost Chronicles. The story of Orusjärvi represents the pattern in its most heartbreaking form, the loss not just of buildings but of irreplaceable knowledge. The church or monastery at Orusjärvi was ancient. Kalmasata vuota ennen havetistan, 300 years before its destruction. If it was destroyed in the early 1600s, as seems likely given the pattern of Swedish invasions, that places its foundation around 1300, making it one of the oldest religious institutions in the Lake Ladoga region. Over those 3 centuries, it accumulated chronicles, written records of births, deaths, marriages, significant events, local history. These were not polished historical narratives but working documents, records kept year by year, generation by generation, by monks who understood their task as preserving memory for future generations. The chronicles would have recorded genealogies, who married whom, which children were born, when people died. The family trees of the region's population, relationships that might otherwise be forgotten. Natural events, unusual weather, failed harvests, abundant years, natural disasters. Patterns that might help future generations predict and prepare. Religious events, the founding of churches, the arrival of relics, miracles attributed to saints, notable acts of piety. The spiritual history of the community. Political events, wars, changes of rule, the arrival and departure of armies, treaties and their violations. The context within which ordinary life unfolded. Local events, fires, crimes, notable achievements, community decisions. The texture of daily life elevated from the ephemeral to the remembered. 300 years of such records represents an extraordinary resource. Historians today would treasure such chronicles, would analyze them for insights into medieval Karelian life, would use them to reconstruct social, economic, religious, and political history with precision impossible from other sources. And then Swedish forces came, and the building burned, and the chronicles, every single page, every recorded event, every preserved name, turned to ash. When Swedish armies stormed the land and burned the sacred halls, the chronicles of centuries went up in flames and walls. The material loss was profound, the building, the liturgical objects, the economic resources. But the loss of the chronicles was different in kind. Material goods can be replaced. New buildings can be built, new icons painted, new vessels forged. But chronicles cannot be replaced. Once burned, the specific knowledge they contained is gone forever. No amount of money or effort can recreate what was written on those pages. What was lost? When we say, the chronicles burned, what specifically was lost? Historical specificity. Oral tradition preserves patterns and general narratives. There was a war, a monastery existed, but loses precise dates, exact sequences, specific details. The chronicles would have provided those details, allowing us to know not just that events occurred but exactly when, in what order, with what specific participants. Alternative perspectives. Most historical records from this period come from the perspective of the powerful, Swedish and Russian chronicles written by court historians, military records kept by commanders. The Lake Ladoga Monastery chronicles would have provided local perspectives, the view from the ground, the experience of ordinary people caught in the machinery of imperial conflict. Completeness. Oral tradition preserves what is dramatic, memorable, symbolically significant. Boring but important information. Steady economic development, gradual environmental changes, the slow evolution of customs. This is forgotten in oral transmission but would have been recorded in chronicles. Verification. With written chronicles, we could verify the oral traditions, could check which stories are historically accurate and which are legendary elaborations. Without the chronicles, we are left with folklore whose relationship to historical fact remains uncertain. Cultural continuity. Communities with written records can maintain more precise connection to their past. They can say, "This is how we did things 300 years ago," with confidence rather than vague approximation. The loss of chronicles was thus a loss of cultural precision, of the ability to know and maintain traditions with certainty. Some traditions claim that Swedish forces didn't burn all the records but stole some and carried them to Stockholm, where they might still exist in archives. This is historically plausible. Victorious armies often took records as intelligence or as trophies. If true, somewhere in Swedish institutional archives there might be Karelian chronicles waiting to be rediscovered. But even if such records exist, they are lost to the people whose history they record. A chronicle sitting in a Stockholm archive, inaccessible to Karelian communities, uncatalogued or misidentified, might as well be ash for all the good it does those whose history it contains. Connunsaari and Heinäsenmaa, the Islands of Faith. The monasteries on Connunsaari and Heinäsenmaa met similar fates, each destruction a catastrophe for the communities they served. Connunsaari, as we discussed in the Bells Beneath the Water episode, cast its bells and treasures into Lake Ladoga when enemies approached. The monastery itself was burned, buildings destroyed, monks killed or scattered. By Schwind's time, the island was simply farmland, all trace of the monastery gone except for place names and folk memory. What was lost at Connunsaari beyond the physical structures? We don't know specifically, because no records survive to tell us what the monastery contained. But we can infer: liturgical books, icons, possibly its own chronicle, certainly accumulated devotional and cultural objects. A community of monks whose knowledge and practices died with them or were scattered. Heinäsenmaa suffered similarly. The island monastery was destroyed, its monks dispersed or killed. By the 19th century, what remained were ruined walls and the crosses where people still left offerings, blending the memory of the monastery with pre-Christian sacred site traditions. The song captures the pattern: Konnunsaari's bells beneath the waves, Heinäsenmaa's ruins stand/sacred places burning across the ravaged land. The destruction was not isolated to one location but systematic across the region. Every significant religious institution faced the same threat, and many succumbed. The cultural and spiritual landscape of Lake Ladoga was permanently altered, transformed from a region dotted with active monasteries and churches to one where such institutions existed primarily in memory and ruins. The hiding of treasures. Before the fires, before the destruction, there were desperate attempts at preservation. We've discussed the bells cast into lakes. But there were other hiding places, other attempts to save what could be saved. Wells were common hiding places. Treasures hidden in the wells, lowered into water, covered with stones, concealed in the one location within a monastery compound where fire would not reach. Water protects against flames, and wells are deep, making retrieval difficult for raiders in a hurry. Some treasures were buried in the ground, not just monastery treasures but those of local people who used the monastery grounds as a secure location. The treasures of Old Kakasalmi and other caches we discussed in the Treasure Seeker episode might include items hidden during monastery destructions. Some precious items were evacuated with fleeing monks, books carried to other monasteries, icons taken to safer locations, portable wealth used to establish new communities elsewhere. The hiding was partially successful. Some treasures were recovered later, some remained hidden and entered legend, some were found by looters or treasure seekers. The bells beneath Lake Ladoga may still be there. The items buried in wells may have been retrieved by survivors or may remain, corroded by centuries in water, waiting in darkness. But for every item successfully hidden and later recovered, many more were simply lost. The chaos of war, the death of those who knew hiding places, the destruction of landmarks that would have indicated locations, all conspired to transform hidden treasures into permanently lost ones. And books, chronicles, manuscripts, these are particularly vulnerable. You can hide a gold chalice in a well, and if it's recovered a century later, it's still a chalice, tarnished but intact. But hide a manuscript in a well and the water destroys it. Hide it in the ground and moisture rots the parchment. Even successful hiding of books often resulted in their ultimate destruction through the very means meant to protect them. The tragedy is multilayered. Things hidden to save them were often destroyed by the hiding, or were saved physically but lost functionally because no one knew where to look for them. The survival of faith without institutions. The burning of the monasteries could destroy buildings, books, and lives. But it could not, ultimately, destroy faith. But the faith survived in whispers and the sacred words/in prayers spoken softly so the enemy hadn't heard. This is one of the most powerful aspects of the story, the persistence of belief even when its institutional supports were annihilated. Orthodox Christianity in the Lake Ladoga region survived the monastery destructions through several mechanisms. Oral transmission, liturgy, prayers, hymns, theological teachings, all could be memorized and passed down orally. Without books, communities relied on human memory, on the careful teaching of each generation by the previous one. Hidden practice. During periods of active persecution or foreign occupation, people practiced their faith secretly, gathering in homes rather than churches, conducting services without clergy when no clergy were available, maintaining the essentials of worship in stripped-down form. Lay leadership. When monasteries were destroyed and monks killed or scattered, lay people stepped into leadership roles. Community members who knew the liturgy led prayers. Those who could read the few books that survived taught others. The faith became less institutionally centered and more community-based. Material simplicity. Elaborate liturgical practice requires elaborate material support, proper vestments, incense, specific books, consecrated vessels. When these were lost, communities maintained faith with simpler practices. A prayer said with genuine devotion in a peasant's cottage was still prayer. God could be worshipped with or without gold chalices. Syncretic adaptation. As we've seen throughout this series, Karelian Orthodoxy was already syncretic, blending Christian practice with older traditions. This flexibility allowed faith to survive by adapting to circumstances, incorporating whatever resources and practices were available. The result was a form of Christianity that was perhaps less polished than what the monasteries had maintained but was also more resilient, more deeply embedded in community practice, less dependent on vulnerable institutions. This survival came at a cost, certainly. Much was lost in theological sophistication, in liturgical precision, in the accumulated wisdom that monasteries had preserved. The faith that survived was not identical to the faith that had been practiced in the monasteries. But it survived. And perhaps that survival, that stubborn persistence in the face of systematic destruction, is itself a form of victory. The weight of absence. There's a particular quality to loss when it's not just personal but cultural, not just material but intellectual. When your house burns, you've lost your possessions, your shelter, your investment of labor. It's devastating, but you can rebuild. The knowledge of how to build a house, the skills and techniques, those persist in the community. You can replace what was lost. But when a library burns, you've lost something that cannot be replaced. The specific knowledge in those books, the particular words and ideas and records, these existed nowhere else. Their loss is absolute. You cannot rebuild a burned manuscript any more than you can unburn ashes back into wood. The people of the Lake Ladoga region lived with this weight of absence. They knew that monasteries had existed, that chronicles had recorded their history, that their ancestors had possessed knowledge and practices that were now lost. They could see the ruins, could hear the stories, but could not recover what had been destroyed. This created a kind of cultural phantom pain, the ache of missing something whose exact shape you can no longer clearly remember. You know something important was lost, but the loss is so complete that you can't fully articulate what it was. The song captures this, the wisdom of the elders lost when flames consumed the page / the voice of ancient Karelia silenced for an age. Not silenced forever, the voice persisted in oral tradition, in folk practices, in the customs and beliefs that Schwint would later collect. But silenced as a clear, recorded, verifiable voice. Transformed from historical record into folklore, from precise knowledge into approximate memory. The monastery pine. At Orusjärvi, among the ruins, stood one physical survivor of the destruction, the monastery pine. This tree, as we mentioned briefly in an earlier episode, was enormous, 3 spans around, suggesting a circumference of perhaps 5 or 6 meters. It was believed to date from the monastery period, perhaps planted when the monastery was founded or perhaps a natural tree that the monks had protected and that became associated with the sacred site. By Schwint's time, the tree had fallen, victim to age, storm, or disease. But even in its fallen state, it was revered. The monastery pine, though dead, served as a physical connection to the destroyed institution, a tangible reminder that the monastery had been real, had existed in this specific location, had left marks on the landscape. Trees can live for centuries. A pine tree growing for 300 or 400 years is not impossible. The monastery pine might have been a seedling when the monastery was founded, might have grown throughout the institution's existence, might have witnessed its destruction and outlasted it by centuries. And trees, unlike books, can survive fires. If the monastery burned but the tree stood at some distance or somehow escaped the flames, it would have been the only living thing that experienced both the monastery's flourishing and its destruction, a witness spanning centuries. The reverence people showed the fallen monastery pine reflects the human need for physical connection to the past. Without buildings, without books, without monastic communities, the tree served as evidence, this happened here. The monastery was real. Our history is real, even though most traces of it are gone. What survived in memory? Though the monasteries burned and the chronicles turned to ash, some knowledge survived in the form Theodor Schwint was collecting: oral tradition, folk memory, stories. People remembered that monasteries had existed. They could point to the locations. They knew the names: Canansari, Heinäsenmaa, Orusjärvi. They had stories about what the monasteries had been like, what happened when they were destroyed, what treasures were hidden. They remembered practices and beliefs that had been taught by monks: prayers, liturgical fragments, theological concepts, moral teachings. These survived in garbled or simplified form, sometimes transformed by generations of oral transmission, but survived nonetheless. They remembered songs. Music and poetry, being memorable, survive oral transmission better than prose. Liturgical chants, hymns, folk songs with religious themes, these continued to be sung even when the institutions that had originally taught them were gone. They maintained locations and practices. The crosses at Heinäsenmaa where people left offerings. The reverence for monastery sites. The continued use of graveyards associated with destroyed churches. The landscape held memory even when buildings were gone. This survival in memory was partial, distorted, uncertain. But it was survival. And it was enough that when Schwint came asking questions, people could tell him, "Here stood a monastery, this is what happened to it, these are the stories we preserve about it." Oral tradition is not an ideal replacement for written records. It's less precise, less comprehensive, less verifiable. But it's what communities fall back on when written records are destroyed. And it works, after a fashion. We know about the Lake Ladoga monasteries because oral tradition preserved that knowledge across the gap of destruction. The perpetrators and the victims. It's worth pausing to consider the human dimensions of monastery destruction from both sides. The Swedish soldiers who burned the monasteries were not, in their own understanding, committing atrocities. They were executing military strategy, enriching themselves through legitimate plunder, by the standards of the time, and fighting against what their own religious authorities told them was false religion worthy of suppression. From their perspective, they were soldiers doing their job. The monasteries were enemy institutions in enemy territory. Destroying them weakened the enemy. Any individual soldier might have felt no particular animosity toward the monks or the Orthodox faith. It was just war, and this is what war required. But from the perspective of the monks and the communities they served, this was catastrophe. The monasteries were sacred spaces, centers of their world, repositories of everything they valued. The soldiers were desecrators, destroyers, agents of evil. Both perspectives were real. War creates situations where people commit acts that are simultaneously justified by their own frameworks and devastating to those affected by them. The soldier following orders and the monk watching his life's work burn are both victims of the larger machinery of imperial conflict that brought them into violent collision. This doesn't excuse the destruction or minimize the loss. But it helps us understand how such things happen, not through simple villainy but through the complex interplay of religious difference, political conflict, military necessity, and the dehumanizing logic of war that allows the enemy to be treated in ways you would never treat actual human beings you knew as individuals. Rebuilding from ashes. After the burnings, after the destructions, life continued. It had to. And slowly, partially, incompletely, communities rebuilt. New churches were constructed, though often simpler than what had been destroyed, and without the accumulated wealth and knowledge of the monasteries. The church at Orusjärvi was rebuilt, though by Schwint's time it was a simple parish church, nothing like the ancient monastery that had preceded it. New priests arrived, though they lacked connection to the local traditions that monastery-trained clergy had possessed. They brought official orthodoxy from Russian centers, which sometimes sat awkwardly with the folk practices that had survived the destruction. New icons were painted, new liturgical books copied or imported, new vestments sewn. The material culture of worship was gradually restored, though never completely. Some items were too precious or too rare to replace, some techniques had been lost with the monks who knew them. But some things could not be rebuilt. The chronicles were gone permanently. The 300 years of recorded history at Orusjärvi existed now only in folk memory, compressed into stories, transformed into legend. The loss was irreversible. The continuity was broken. The new churches were not organic developments of the destroyed monasteries but new foundations, imposed from outside, lacking the deep local roots and accumulated traditions of what had been lost. This pattern, destruction followed by partial reconstruction that never quite recovers what was lost, repeated across the Lake Ladoga region. The landscape was dotted with rebuilt churches, each one marking a site of destruction, each one a mixture of restoration and irreversible loss. Standing in the ruins. Return with me to Orusjärvi, to the site where the ancient monastery once stood. By Schwindt's time in 1879, little remained. Some foundation stones perhaps, scattered masonry, the monastery pine, though by then fallen. A new church stood nearby, but it was a different building in a different style, clearly much newer. Standing there, knowing the story, you feel the absence. 300 years of accumulated knowledge, burned. Monks killed or scattered, their community destroyed. The liturgy that had been chanted here for centuries, silenced. The learning that had been pursued, ended. The manuscripts that had been copied, turned to ash. The absence is palpable. This should be a place of continuity, of tradition stretching back centuries unbroken. Instead, it's a place of rupture, of violent ending, of knowledge lost. But there's also something stubborn about the site. A church stands here again. People worship here still. The faith survived even though the institution didn't. The community persisted even though its center was destroyed. This is what humans do. We rebuild. Perhaps not as well, perhaps imperfectly, perhaps with loss and compromise. But we rebuild. We refuse to let destruction be final. We gather the ashes and from them construct something new. It's not the same. The rebuilt church is not the ancient monastery. The new practices are not the old traditions. The folk memory is not the precise chronicle. But it's something. It's survival. It's the stubborn insistence that what mattered before still matters, that what was sacred remains sacred even when its physical manifestations are destroyed, that community and faith can persist across rupture. The burning monastery is gone. But its memory remains, preserved in place names, in stories, in the pattern of settlement, in the faith that continues to be practiced. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson, that what truly matters cannot be burned. Buildings burn. Books burn. Bodies burn. But faith, memory, community, these are more resilient than material form. They survive in whispers and the sacred word, in prayers spoken softly, in customs maintained, in stories told. The flames consumed the page, but not the voice. The voice of ancient Karelia was silenced for an age, but not forever. It spoke again to Schwindt, speaks again to us now, speaks still in every retelling of the story. The monastery burned. But the faith survived. And in that survival is a kind of victory, even in the ashes.